The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth as I sprinted through the rows of corn. The dry stalks towered over me, their rustling leaves creating a problem in the dark. The only sound louder was my own breathing, ragged and uneven as I pushed myself to run faster. Behind me, I could hear him, the man. His footsteps pounded the ground, closer with each heartbeat, each breath. It had started just an hour ago, right before sunset. I had been taking my usual walk along the edge of the field when I noticed him standing there, too close, watching me. At first, I thought it was just another person enjoying the fall evening, but something in the way he stared made my skin crawl. When I turned to walk back toward my house, he started following me. Slowly at first, but then faster, his pace matching mine until I broke into a full-out sprint. He followed. Now I was lost in the cornfield, the moon my only source of light. The maze of stalks stretched in every direction. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Every time I slowed down, I could hear him gaining on me, his breath raspy and his muttered words unintelligible but terrifying. I turned sharply, hoping to lose him in the dense rows. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind through the corn, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I had lost him. Then I heard the snap of a stalk and his low voice growling. "I know you're close." Panicking, I kept running, dodging left and right, trying to confuse him. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, and I stumbled but caught myself. Just ahead, I saw the faint glow of a lantern hanging on the post at the edge of the field. Safety. If I could just reach the light, maybe someone would be there. I could scream for help. I didn't make it far. A hand reached out from the darkness, rough and cold, grabbing my wrist. I screamed and struggled, but his grip tightened. He yanked me toward him, and in the dim light, I saw his face, pale, twisted with a grin that made my blood run cold. And then something unexpected happened. The ground beneath us shifted, as though the earth itself was moving. His grin faltered. I felt it first, a strange sensation, like the earth was giving way under our own feet. Before I could react, the ground collapsed. We both plunged downward into a hidden sinkhole, the soft earth swallowing us whole. I landed hard, dirt and cornstalks raining down on me, but somehow I was alive. Disoriented and coughing, I struggled to my feet. The man wasn't so lucky, though. He had fallen head first, his body lying twisted and motionless in the soft dirt below. His face was turned toward me, eyes wide open, but vacant. He wasn't breathing. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, staring at his lifeless form. The field above seemed impossibly far away, the cold wind howling through the gap we had fallen through. I looked at him one last time before turning and crawling my way out to the top, my hands trembling, my body aching. As I reached the edge of the field, I collapsed, gasping for air, knowing that no one would believe me of what just happened. The man was gone, buried beneath the earth that had consumed him. I never went near that cornfield ever again. It was a perfect fall afternoon. The air was cool, the leaves were in full orange and red splendor, and my family was in high spirits as we arrived at the pumpkin patch. My husband, Mark, and our two kids, Emma and Jake, ran ahead, excited to pick out their favorite pumpkins. The patch was crowded with families, kids laughing, and parents snapping pictures. The perfect day. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone was watching us. At first, I chalked it up to the usual crowd. After all, there was plenty of people around. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, I noticed the same man. He was always just out of the way, never with anyone, never holding a pumpkin, just watching. His His dirty brown jacket and grimy baseball cap pulled low over his face made him easy to recognize in the crowd. I told myself it was just a coincidence. There were hundreds of people here. But as we wandered deeper into the pumpkin patch, moving through rows of pumpkins, he seemed to follow us. I caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye, always lurking just a few steps behind. The laughter and cheer around me started to fade, drowned out by the thudding of my heart. "Mom, look at this one!" My son Jake called, pulling me toward a large pumpkin. I forced a smile, trying to push down the growing fear, but as I bent down to help him, I felt the unmistakable weight of eyes on me again. I straightened up and looked around. There he was, closer this time, standing behind a row of tall pumpkins, partially hidden, but his gaze was fixed onto us. My stomach turned. I grabbed my husband's arm, pulling him aside. "Do you see that guy?" Mark followed my gaze. "What guy?" "The one in the brown jacket. He's been watching us since we got here." "Stay here with the kids," he said, his voice low. "I'm gonna go talk to him." As Mark strode toward the man, I pulled my kids, Jake and Emma, close to me. I watched as my husband approached the stalker, his figure tense. The man in the jacket stood still for a moment, then abruptly turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of pumpkins. Mark came back, shaking his head. He took off before I could say anything. Probably just some weirdo. We decided it was time to go. As we made our way back toward the parking lot, I kept scanning the area, but I didn't see him again. My nerves began to settle, but that sense of unease still lingered. We reached our car, loaded the pumpkins in the back seat, and buckled my kids in. As we drove down the winding dirt road, Mark glanced at me, his face now serious. "Do you think we should call someone? About that guy?" Before I could answer, the car jerked violently, veering to the right. Mark slammed on the brakes and we skidded to a stop. Mark jumped out of the car and I followed him, confused. As we looked down at the front tire, we noticed our front tire had been slashed. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel coming right behind us. I turned to see the man in the same brown jacket emerging from the trees at the edge of the road, a knife in his hand, his eyes wild with rage. "Get the kids!" my husband shouted. I ran back to the car, locking the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone to call 911. From the back seat, I could hear Emma crying and Jake asking what was happening, but I couldn't focus on them. My eyes were glued to the scene unfolding outside. Mark squared off with the man, who was getting closer, his grip on the knife tightening. But just as the stalker lunged, Mark swung the tire iron he'd grabbed from the trunk. It connected with a sickening thud against the man's arm, and the knife clattered to the ground. He stumbled backwards, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain, but he wasn't done. He lunged again, but this time Mark was faster. Another swing, this time to the man's ribs, and he collapsed to the ground, groaning. In the distance, I could hear the faint wail of sirens. The police arrived within minutes, pulling the stalker off the ground and cuffing him. As they led him to the back of the squad car, his eyes met mine through the window. His face was pale, his expression a mix of anger and fear, but he didn't say a word. As the car drove away, I collapsed into the front seat, crying. It was over. The stalker was caught, but the image of his wild eyes and that knife would stay with me for a long time. It was a chilly October evening, the kind where the wind seemed to bite at your skin, carrying the smell of dried leaves and the faint scent of wood smoke. I had just finished work and decided to stop by the big box store to pick up some last-minute Halloween decorations. My house was always the best decorated on the block, and I wasn't about to let my neighbors outshine me this year. I grabbed a cart and wandered down the seasonal aisle, browsing through plastic skeletons, fake spider webs, and jack-o'-lantern lights. The store was almost empty, just a few other shoppers picking through the remnants of the Halloween section. As I reached for a package of glow-in-the-dark tombstones, I noticed someone standing at the end of the aisle. A woman. She was pale, her skin almost waxy under the fluorescent lights. Her clothes were plain, just a long, faded black coat and a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Her dark hair hung limp around her face, and she stood there, staring at me. I looked away, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that crept up my spine. I kept shopping, tossing decorations into the cart, but every time I glanced up, she was there, always standing at the end of the aisle, just watching me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe she was waiting for me to move so she could grab something. But then I made my way to a different part of the store. She followed me. I turned down the aisle with the Halloween animatronics. Giant, life-size figures with glowing eyes and eerie sound effects lined the shelves. As I examined a motion-activated skeleton that let out a creepy laugh, I felt a presence behind me. I turned sharply. There she was again. Standing closer to me this time, her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. My heart started to race. I forced a smile, hoping it would break the tension. "Can I help you with something?" I said to her, my voice sounding more nervous than I intended. She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes dark, hollow. I turned back to the shelves, trying to ignore the heavy feeling in the air. I grabbed a few more items and hurried toward the checkout line. But as I pushed my cart, I could feel her following me. Every time I glanced back, she was there, her pace slow and deliberate, her face expressionless. At the register, I felt a wave of relief. Surely, she wouldn't follow me out of the store. I loaded my things onto the conveyor belt, glancing around nervously. The woman was nowhere to be seen. I paid for my items and headed out into the parking lot. The sun had set, and the store's parking lot was dimly lit by flickering lights. I found my car and began loading the bags into the trunk, but the feeling of being watched returned. I looked around, and there she was, standing at the far end of the parking lot, her silhouette barely visible in the shadows. I quickly threw the last bag into the trunk and slammed it shut. I got into my car, locking the doors behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my keys. As the engine roared, I looked up. She was gone. I let out a shaky breath, trying to tell myself it was just some weird coincidence, maybe some disturbed person who happened to be there. I pulled out of the parking lot and started the short drive home, the decorations rattling in the trunk as I drove. As I turned onto my street, my headlights illuminated the rows of houses, each one dark except for the faint glow of porch lights. I pulled into my driveway, still glancing over my shoulder, half expecting her to be standing there watching. I grabbed the bags from the trunk and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I leaned against the door, listening to the silence of the house, trying to calm my racing heart. After a few minutes, I laughed at myself. Come on. It's just some strange woman. Stop overreacting. I put the decorations in the living room and went to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. As the water boiled, I glanced out the window over the sink into my backyard. The wind was picking up, rustling the trees and scattering leaves across the lawn. Everything seemed normal. But then I saw her. Standing at the edge of the yard, barely visible in the dark, her black coat blending into the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. She had followed me home. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I explained the situation to the dispatcher. They assured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours as I watched her from the window, her figure unmoving, her eyes still locked on my house. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the street. I rushed outside to meet them, pointing toward the yard where she had been standing. But when they searched, of course, she was gone. Vanished. The officers did a thorough check of the area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of entry. They told me it was probably just a homeless person or someone disturbed, and that they'd keep an eye out on the neighborhood. But I knew what I saw. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak and rustle outside sent a surge of fear through me. I kept imagining her pale face, those hollow eyes, watching me from the darkness. But as the hours passed, exhaustion took over, and I finally drifted off. In the morning, I woke to a soft tapping sound. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from the window. I got up slowly and pulled the curtain aside. There she was again, standing right outside the glass, her face inches from mine. Her lips curved into a slow, twisted smile. Before I could scream, before I could even react, the window shattered, and she reached through, grabbing me with ice-cold hands. I struggled, but her grip was like iron. She pulled me closer, her breath cold against my skin as she whispered, "I've been waiting for you." Then, just as quickly, her grip loosened, her eyes widened, and her body went rigid before collapsing to the ground. Behind her stood one of the officers from last night, his gun drawn, his face pale. They had been patrolling the area, watching the house, when they saw her trying to break in. The stalker lay motionless on the ground, her eyes now vacant, the twisted smile still on her face. The nightmare was over. But even now, every time I walk past a window or hear the wind rustling outside, I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, somewhere, watching me.